else knows me, I'm Desiree. I'm with the Alliance for the Arts, so I'm happy to be here and looking forward to an evening of conversation and connection with everybody. Jessica Todd is our curator for the Plays Well with Others exhibition, so I'll pass the baton over your way. Give a little intro about you.
Yeah, sure. So hi, I'm Jessica Todd. I curated the show up at the Alliance right now through October 17th, which is Plays Well with Others, and Amelia is one of the artists in that show. Basically the show, it's been just to give everyone a background. I don't know how many of you were at any of the other talks or anything that we've had, but the show was a little over a year in the making, and just wanted to create something that was fun and playful, and over that year it kind of evolved, and each of the artists really ran with this theme of play and took it in really interesting directions. And I kind of started conceiving the show with some local artists in mind, and then wanted to also invite some people from around the country. And actually just happened upon Amelia's work on Instagram, and I absolutely loved it, and it was in my mind for a long time. And then when this show started kind of coming together around this theme of play, I reached out and said, would you like to join us? And she graciously did, and we're so excited to have her work in the show. And a piece called Other Selves, and 4 kind of sculptures that are part of a series together. And yeah, just so I'll go ahead and introduce Amelia. She did her BFA at Indiana University and her MFA at the University of Memphis. She lives in Nashville now, and has been in too many shows and publications to list, but we're really excited to have her here. I'm so excited to hear more about her super fun, just engaging studio practice around this work. I love her pieces for the show. They just, they kind of have this reference of nostalgia and childhood, and you just kind of want to take the sculptures down and like hug them and bring them on an adventure with you. So so I will let Amelia take it away.
Well, first I want to say thank you so much for including me in this show. You've done so much work for this show, and I really appreciate it. It's great. So thank you. This is such a nice small group. Because it's so small, if anybody has any questions or anything, please interrupt me. But I was going to kind of start from like my childhood and then kind of wind my way up to kind of how I started making the work that I'm making now. Can you guys hear me okay? Can you guys hear me? I think it froze for a minute.
I can hear you.
Okay. So I grew up in a very rural area in the Midwest, and I really had like no visual stimulation where I grew up, and I was very influenced by cartoons and toys, particularly like The Simpsons and Ren and Stimpy, Rocky and Bullwinkle and stuff like that. Those were really important to me, and toys in particular were really important to me. They really kind of served as like a jumping off point to imagination and living in such a stark environment in the middle of nowhere, which was literally like Amish country. It was just really important to me and a crucial part of my childhood. And so then also my father was a painter in his spare time, so I grew up around his art supplies a lot. And then I ended up going to college, like you said, at Indiana University, actually in Indianapolis, not in Bloomington. But I started as a psychology major. My mom's a psychologist, and I thought that was the right move, but it wasn't. But I ended up kind of finding my way into the fine art department later, and I did get a BFA. But I was painting in undergrad a lot of really large scale still lives that I would take from like blowing up photographs of like my kitchen counter or like my bathroom counter. I was really interested in the objects that I lived with every day and kind of like the intimacy that we share with objects over time that we don't really think about. I was also interested in kind of creating like a narrative between these objects. So by the time I graduated, my senior thesis show was like 6-foot tall still lifes that I had blown up that were in large part kind of referencing an idea of like a narrative. But in graduate or in undergraduate, it was really important to me because I had some key professors that kind of taught me. I remember one professor always said to me, if you're going to paint an object or if you're going to paint an image from a photograph, you really have to kind of transcend that image or that photograph. And I know that sounds so simple, but it really kind of sparked something in me. I was really kind of a late bloomer in college. It took me a long time to take my grades seriously or my work seriously at that time in my life. And so it really kind of sparked this interest in me and like that I could create something new with the painting and that I could kind of transcend what I was trying to represent. And that I could really create a feeling or a mood with a certain color or a certain composition. And that was really key to me. And then I graduated and I really kind of stopped making work for a while. I was a bartender and I was kind of lost in the nightlife of that kind of lifestyle. And I really didn't make anything for some time. But I kind of slowly found my way back to art. Eventually, I had gotten a full-time job and I had felt like something was missing. So I started taking a lot of walks with my dog and I was photographing images of nature and I started painting images of plant life or like flowers that were kind of slowly decaying. And it got me kind of drawn back into ideas of like a palette and how certain colors could portray certain emotions or certain feelings. So at that time, I was painting these really kind of like tightly rendered paintings of flowers and compositions where like some of the petals would be falling off, or I was thinking a lot about like rendering and creating a sense of drama in an image. Also again, thinking kind of about how to portray a sense of narrative without really spelling anything out. And then I kind of made a bold decision. I was working a full-time job and I was feeling kind of lost and really far away from the work that I had been kind of starting to get into in undergrad. And I didn't really have much of an art community around me. I was living in Indianapolis, but I didn't have any connection to the art scene there. And I kind of felt stuck. So I kind of had an instinct that I really needed to give myself time to kind of pursue a career in the arts. So I abruptly kind of quit my job and moved to a very rural town in Michigan where I didn't really know anyone. And I was told myself that I would live there for 6 months and do nothing but paint, which I did. It was a really like lonely time for me, but I had no audience for my work. I wasn't on social media at all. I didn't have an art community of people that were looking at my work. So it was really a crucial time for me in terms of like getting to the core of what I wanted to make without thinking about how it was going to be perceived at all. So I started painting images of women. I would look at images of women in magazines or photographs. And I was particularly interested in like images of women going through transition. Sometimes I would paint women who are pregnant or who seemed kind of lost. Sometimes I would paint groups of women. And at this time, I became really interested in kind of how you could subtly suggest a mood or an emotion based on like a subtle, suggestion of like body language. I started to get more interested in colors. I would mix colors for hours and try to like create a certain tone with the painting. And I was really thinking a lot about like how you could give a painting a sense of presence in a room and how it would kind of like confront you. I was very much like a painter's painter at this time. I was also thinking about visual rhythm and kind of walking a line between like abstraction, representation. The figures were almost hyper realistic in some cases, but then they would be kind of like part of them would be flattened out, or there would be like an abstract pattern in the background. So I was really kind of pushing those boundaries. And then that 6 months started to come up, and I obviously couldn't not have a job forever. So I decided that what made the most sense was to apply to graduate school. So I applied to schools all over the country. Like I said, I was like a late bloomer in undergrad, so I didn't feel like I had the grades to get into some really prestigious school. So I applied to kind of like mid-level schools all over, and I ended up randomly going to a school in Memphis. It was actually a school that my mom found, but I just felt a connection to that city, having never really been to the South or lived in the South before. But during that time, I was there for 3 years, and when I started graduate school, I kind of started off where I was in Michigan, where I was painting images of women. I was thinking about identity. I was thinking about, individual identity versus group identity. I was thinking about color. And over those 3 years, my work kind of slowly, I wanted to have like more freedom in what I was painting. So instead of using visual references of figures, I started drawing cartoon figures. And then I would draw the same thing where I would draw like a group of cartoon figures, in like a mound or like a cloud or something. And then over time, the cartoon figures became more and more abstract. So it was like I was on this path kind of like leading me towards complete abstraction. And I was also thinking a lot about making objects, but I didn't really know how to do that. And I started that by making these obnoxiously thick stretchers that would like hang off the wall, that were like annoyingly heavy and just ridiculous. But it was like my way of kind of thinking of it like a painting or as an object. I didn't really treat it like an object, though. I didn't like paint the sides. I still just painted the front. But it was kind of like a stepping stone into thinking of my work in a more sculptural way. And by the time I had my thesis show in graduate school, I was starting to make more object-like. I would like cut panels into shapes and then stretch them and then paint on top of them, because it felt less restrictive to me than like working in like a rectangle or a square. And I started to think about my painting differently at that time. Instead of thinking about a painting as like a window into another world, I started to think of it as like something that just represented itself, which was a kind of a big turning point for me. So after graduate school, I was determined to kind of not fall into the same slump that I had after undergrad, where I just didn't make anything for a while. And I was once again found myself kind of without any kind of an audience. My friends from graduate school had moved away. I was still in Memphis at that time. So I really just kind of tried to push my experimentation, and I was working with a lot of collage and just using kind of like random fabrics to kind of create a base for paintings. And I think the inflatables kind of started because I had an old stuffed animal in one of my closets, and I like cut it open and I took out the fiber in it. And I was already using collage, so I was kind of like started stuffing into the collage, and that was kind of like an aha moment. But it still took me a while to kind of really embrace that. And then I think the next kind of thing I made like that is I made like a puffy frame for a painting where I puffed up the sides. And then over time, like I slowly just kind of started getting more and more into that, and I kind of just completely leaned in. But even at that time, I was still treating them like paintings. I was painting on top of them. I was painting or drawing on top of them. And I was, at that time too, I was looking at a lot of coloring books that reminded me of my childhood, and I would rip out scraps and like reposition them to kind of get ideas for drawings or generate ideas for drawings or shapes for the pieces. And then I moved to Nashville a year after graduating, and I was able to kind of move into a better studio environment, which allowed me to work in larger scale. And I had a show at Elephant Gallery called Mop It, which I was able to just get really large. I had an 8-foot tall inflatable in that piece. And that just allowed me to kind of really push the boundaries. And I started to really think of myself as more as a sculptor than as a painter, because the drawing and the painting kind of fell away, and it became more about just color and the objects. And I think, in terms of kind of my overall theme, I think it kind of goes back to the very beginning of when I was a child, and kind of influenced by like the ability to kind of subtly suggest a tone or like an emotion or something with like body language. I think about body language a lot when I'm designing my inflatables, or thinking about like they always kind of feel sometimes a little bit wonky or a little bit off, and that's really important to me. And I'm also just, as someone who grew up with a psychologist as a mother and who did study psychology for a little while, I'm very interested in how the toys and like cartoons of our youth influence kind of who we become as adults and how we relate to the world as adults. And I also like to think of them as kind of like this jumping off point to imagination and to new possibilities, as that's something that I relied on so heavily as a child. And also kind of also how we look back at our childhood through the lens of adulthood, and how that's kind of skewed. And I'm still trying, a lot of the things that I was doing even when I was painting, I'm still trying to kind of avoid an easy read of a piece. I want them to feel a little mysterious, or like, I also obviously want people to kind of have a jolt of recognition in the work, especially people who are of the same generation as I am or who grew up in the 90s. I think that's important to me. I often kind of align that to like when you're in a vintage store and you come across a toy or something that maybe you had when you were a child, and this kind of like jolt of like, oh my gosh, you know, that kind of jarring feeling of something like that feels so mysterious but so familiar at the same time. But yeah, that's pretty much it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I know I have questions, but I will ask first if anyone else out there has any questions that they'd like to ask. You can just unmute yourself and shout.
So you mentioned that you used to watch Ren and Stimpy.
Yeah.
And you work with inflatables. Do you recall the Ren and Stimpy toy that was an inflatable plush toy?
No, I don't think I had Ren and Stimpy toys. I will look that up though.
They sold it at Suncoast. I remember in the mall when I was younger. If you ever seen one of those inflatable Easter rabbits that squeaked,
yeah,
that had a lifespan of about 2 weeks, they just took something like that and they put a little plush thing, but it was just Ren and Stimpy bizarre inflatable plush. Like, why that shouldn't be a thing, but they just made it anyway, and they had one character. I wasn't sure if that was something you had seen before or not.
No, I'm gonna look that up and maybe I can find one on eBay or something, but no, I don't think so.
It's from I think early 90s.
So what year were you born?
I was born in 1985.
Okay, so I'm much earlier. I'm 72, and I get a whole different vibe. I watched Star Trek reruns as a kid, so I'm sure you've had the Tribbles reference from the fur. So that's what I see a little bit. And I don't know, the one that's currently in the show, I see a little bit of the Venus of Willendorf going on as well with the shape and the kind of bulges, I guess.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So that's kind of the two things that stuck out to me, but I'm a little older. I always have to ask, you know, when you said you grew up in the 80s, I kind of half a little bit grew up in the 80s, but.
Yeah, there's some overlap there. That's interesting.
Yeah.
He's a little older than I am.
Yeah. I still watch Ren and Stimpy though.
Just for you. Yeah.
I know who they are.
Yeah.
I think that's all our questions.
Thank you. Does anybody else out there have any questions? You can just unmute and speak if you'd like. Okay, well, I have questions. I was interested just, I don't know where to start. Maybe I'll start, I'm curious about, I had a few people when I was walking through the show ask me kind of about your process with particularly like the latex pieces, but I assume all of them maybe have a similar process, and I kind of hypothesize what it might be, but I don't actually know the specifics of your process if you're
they start with panel that I cut into a shape, and then I realized that it's a lot cheaper for me to go buy like sheets at like vintage or like thrift stores. So I go to like a thrift store and I buy a bunch of used sheets because they're super cheap and they're perfect material for my work. And then I wash them, and then I'm basically like an upholstery artist, really. I mean, because I'm like just using that technique where I'm stuffing and I'm upholstering it to the panel. And as the more I've done this process, the better I've gotten at kind of controlling the shape, because I use polyfill to stuff it, which I buy in giant like 10-pound boxes or whatever, but you can get it at like Michael's. And then I use paper mache. I use this kind of like really thin paper because I need to like seal all the cracks from where I've upholstered the piece. And then I layer just like tons and tons and tons of layers of latex paint. It's kind of a really long process because it takes forever to kind of build up that kind of plasticky surface. And that's really it. Sometimes I'll use like in that yellow piece that's in the Alliance right now, there's like that ribbing that goes through, and that's actually the inside ribbing of like a t-shirt that I ripped apart to kind of create that raised area. But yeah, that's pretty much it. And then the fur is just fake fur in a similar process.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
So had you like learned anything about upholstery? Like what kind of led you to that process? Or did you just, I mean, were you kind of intentionally going from a place, were you like, this is what I have in mind and I need to learn some upholstery techniques? Or are you just like independent invention?
I really just kind of invented it. Like I just taught myself. I was actually thinking not that long ago, it'd be fun to work for an upholsterer as like a part-time job or something to get more techniques. But I really just kind of taught myself, and it really evolved very slowly over time. I mean, like I said, I was like doing like the first inflatables I ever made were like super thin, you know, and it took a really long time for me to kind of, and it just came from doing it over and over and over again. Like every piece is a little bit better, is a little bit more polished. But I really just taught myself, I would say.
So I have a question, since we're playing with this idea of nostalgia. Do you ever miss the attachment that you experimented with your paintings, particularly the ones where you were, you know, creating these different women figures? Do you ever try to return to that or go back or miss it at all?
Sometimes, yeah, sometimes I'll see a painting or something that really strikes me, and I'll kind of remember feeling like how into painting I was. I mean, I was obsessed with painting, and I assumed that's what I would always do. And I do miss it sometimes. I did go through a period of time after graduate school where I thought I was kind of like at a fork, and I was like, I'm either going to kind of really go forward with this sculptural, or I'm going to kind of return to painting. And I was kind of unsure, but I just, over time, I think I started to lose interest in the painting, and I was more interested in creating an object. So I don't anymore think about going back to it. I don't even think I'd know how to paint really at this point, because it was so second nature at that time. And now I don't even know how I would approach it. It almost seems impossible, but I do miss it sometimes when I see a painting that really grabs me, and I'm like, oh, the colors that they used or the composition or something. Yeah.
Does anyone else out there have any more questions? I have a couple more too, but I want to give other people a chance to ask if you'd like. Okay. So I was curious, like you were saying about like the time that you spent away from your practice, and just I was interested how long that period was and kind of what that journey was like getting back into it, what the challenges were. And then you mentioned going to Michigan. I'm just curious if you did that at like as part of a residency, or if you just like independently decided to do that.
I independently did that. When I got out of undergrad, I didn't touch any kind of art for like 2 years. And what happened was that I managed to get, because like I said, I was bartending for a long time, and I had managed to get like a good paying 9-to-5 job in sales. And I had just saved, when I was doing a lot of reading at the time, and I think it just like I slowly kind of instinctively started making work again. And when I decided that I wanted to like give myself a chance as an artist, because I was in Indianapolis, I was working a 9-to-5 job, and I was hanging out with a lot of bar industry people. I didn't have artists in my life. You know, I knew that if I continued going forward down that path, it was never going to be a big part of my life. And so I don't know how to explain it. I just had such an instinctual feeling of like, I have to just do this. And so I saved a lot of money, saved all the money that I could from my job. And I moved to Michigan. It wasn't part of a residency or anything like that. My parents had a house in Michigan that they were living in part-time, and it was just a small little house in a beach town, in a very rural beach town area. So I was luckily able to make that work. If I had to pay rent or something somewhere, it would have been harder. I would have had to get a job in Michigan, but because I had saved money and because of that house, I was able to kind of not have a job for 6 months, basically. But yeah, I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, I mean, that's huge. And I'm always kind of interested in people's different varying journeys because I think especially for people who went to school and, you know, I did a undergrad degree in art, not a BA, not a BFA, but then spent a few years off and went back to grad school. And I just remember in grad school thinking like, well, the people who succeed are the ones who like get right out and they have their career ready to go. And if I don't do that, or if I get a job, I'm like failing in some way. And there is so much psychological of like, oh, if I didn't keep up that momentum, or I sold out in some other way, that there's sort of no return, or I talked to people who've been out of school or who didn't go to school and who think that doing an MFA or needing to go to residencies or just like keeping that sort of resume going in a way is the only path forward. And so I think more often than not, honestly, I hear from people like you that have this sort of disjointed journey of getting there and then it totally changing your practice and sort of happening upon these sculptural works from painting and kind of the psychological side that goes into being like, okay, like it's okay, I can leave behind the painting just because I studied that or I sort of mastered that doesn't mean that it has to be everything going forward, and just kind of those sort of limitations we put in our own heads about artistic practice.
Yeah, I think it's totally almost the opposite of that. I've known people who've had success really early, and it almost prevented them from having a really fruitful long term, because sometimes that can really kind of jar you because you're already then cornered into like a certain aesthetic, you know. And I wasn't working with a gallery for a really long time. I wasn't showing for a really long time, and because of that I had the freedom to really like dig deep and like find my voice as an artist. And the more quickly you're working with a gallery, the harder it is to do that, because then you're thinking about how is your work going to sell, how is it going to be perceived, and it's really hard to kind of just abruptly change what you're making when you're already kind of locked into those kind of situations. So I am so thankful that like I didn't have anything going for me when I moved to Michigan, because it allowed me to just be completely free, really, to make whatever I needed to make at that time. You know, I think it's so crucial to have those times before you get locked in to something, to like a brand or something, you know.
Yeah, I totally hear that. And I worked at an artist residency for 6 years, so I just met a lot of artists who came from every totally different background. And I think that makes sense about people who sort of get that early success and you're right out of grad school and you just sort of, you're like, well, this works, so I'm going to stick with it. And just that there are different journeys and different ways of getting there. And so it's really nice to hear about your journey and that you were able to kind of find this different voice by taking a different path. And I enjoy your work so much. It's so delightful. Does anybody else have any questions out there? Comments? Anything? All right. Well, is there anything else you want to add, Amelia?
No, I mean, thank you so much for all the work you've done. It's really been great. So I'm happy to be a part of it.
Thank you so much. No, thank you for being in the show, and thank you, Desiree, for hosting on the fly. Aaron, our gallery director, is probably somewhere sleepless with his new baby, so he couldn't join us, but I'll give him a virtual shout out in case he watches this later, for all of his help with the show and the Alliance for hosting it. And yeah, it's up through October 17th, so everyone has a chance to stop by, and we'll keep posting content until then. So yeah. Thank you so much, Amelia, for sharing with us and for being here tonight. And
Thank you.
Yeah, that was really lovely.